Jacob Hurd Smith was an officer, a gentleman, and a war hero. He was born on January 29, 1840, in Jackson County, Ohio. Jacob enlisted in the Union Army at the beginning of the U.S. Civil War in 1861. The young Mr. Smith fought in several battles during his service. He was a member of the 1st Army of Ohio. His unit went into action in 1862, and their first campaign was to support the Army of Tennessee on April 6. That was the day of one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, the Battle of Shiloh. The engagement between the blue and the gray lasted until the next day. The large Union Army overpowered the Confederates, despite suffering larger casualties. Over 8,000 Union soldiers were wounded, and over 1,700 were killed. Jacob was wounded on the second day of the battle when he was shot in the hip. He would carry that bullet around his body for the rest of his life. Despite suffering near debilitating wounds, he tried to return to combat, but the severe injury kept him from doing so. Because of his injury and wanting to continue his service in the Army, Jacob was sent to the Invalid Corp, a unit made up of wounded soldiers or old soldiers who were aged out of combat service. Jacob Smith decided to become an Army recruiter and was stationed in Louisville, Kentucky for the next 3 years. During his time in the city, he signed up a large number of recruits for the United States Army Colored Troop Division, earning him high accolades from his superior officers. While stationed in Louisville, Smith got married on November 10, 1864 for the first time to Emma Haverty. Their marriage would last for 16 years. Due to his outstanding military record, he was promoted to major in 1867. 2 years later, however, a large amount of legal trouble began to surface, many occurring during his time in Louisville, Kentucky. In 1869, Jacob's father-in-law, Daniel Haverty, was being sued for fraud that was in connection with bankruptcy. Smith was called into court when his creditors believed that Mr. Haverty was hiding assets from them, and one of the people whom he was hiding said funds was Jacob. His personal assets went from $4,000 in 1862 to over $40,000 in 1865. Smith testified that he had no idea what his father-in-law was doing, and his large bank account was from recruiting bounties. This in turn led to him being part of a much larger recruiting scheme which involved many parties. Smith claimed that he thought it was legal and used the bonus money that was supposed to be spread around to other recruiters on investments and luxuries instead. When the East Coast recruitment boards wanted their money back, lucky for Jacob, he actually made money on the side dealings and was able to pay them back, according to him. At the same time this was happening, Jacob Smith was a temporary judge advocate in the U.S. Army and was trying his best to make the position a permanent one. One of the creditors at his father-in-law's trial informed the Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Army, Joseph Holt, about Smith's shady recruitment scheme during the Civil War. Jacob wrote a letter to Judge Joseph Holt, pleading his case by talking about his brave combat duty and one who took it upon himself all of the odium that the rebels and the conservatives of Louisville, Kentucky heaped upon him by being the first officer, to my knowledge, who commenced mustering into service the colored man in Kentucky during the year 1863. The judge didn't buy into Jacob's explanation and had his letter forwarded to the Secretary of War, John Rawlings, and recommended that Jacob Smith's appointment to become a permanent advocate be reviewed by the U.S. Senate Committee on Military Affairs. Jacob Smith wrote a letter to the Secretary of War further explaining his actions in recruitment bounty schemes and said that he was a gullible dupe, but he repaid everyone, and said his only crime was that he used other people's money for profit. The secretary didn't buy into his story either. News of Smith's involvement with the recruiting scheme reached President Grant, who personally revoked Jacob's temporary position as judge advocate. Judge Holt censored Jacob Smith's actions and concluded that by his own testimony believed that it was okay to use other people's money for their own financial gain, and said, by his conflicting statements, his unfortunate explanation, he was placed in a dilemma full of embarrassment. Later that year, Jacob was involved in a lawsuit in a Chicago court which would last for several years until it was settled in 1883. In 1871, he was sued over non-payment of a $7 harness. He would also drag this case out for years until 1901. In 1871, he received a written reprimand from his superior officer for comparing him to Prussian General Helmut von Moltke. Jacob Smith was officially court-martialed in 1885 for conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman for deeds committed at the Mint Saloon in Bracketville, Texas. He lost $135 in a draw poker game and refused to pay. He was found guilty of violating his officer's code of conduct and was sent to Fort Clark, where he was imprisoned for a year and lost half his pay. He was retried again a year later and was found guilty again. Smith wrote a letter to President Grover Cleveland, who reduced his sentence to a written reprimand, and his military career was saved. Jacob Smith didn't learn his lesson, however, and nearly lost his rank and career in the U.S. Army when he was reprimanded once again in 1891 for using enlisted men as unpaid labor in his home. In December of 1899, after spending several years in the American frontier waging war against Native Americans, Smith was promoted to colonel and sent to the Philippines, where he would achieve his greatest goal in life, to forever live in infamy with the people of the Philippine Islands.